Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Tigran Zakaryan. He's a historian, media expert and translator from Yerevan. His interests include the representation of the past in history textbooks and academic publications. Together we will talk about the gaps in Armenian textbooks. Welcome Tigran, and thank you for joining us. So you study the history textbooks in Armenia. Can you tell me a bit why you do this first? And why is it important, or is it important at all for people to learn history?
First of all, thank you for inviting me here. Anyone who is interested in history is of course interested in its representation. History is not only about facts, and it is not as much about facts as about its interpretations, their interpretations. So therefore, histories could be multiple, very different, sometimes contradicting. It's only natural for a human being to be interested in his or own past in order to build future, but also to build your present. It's very important. Identities are somehow built on your past, on your own perception of the past. Currently we see identities are being built not only based on past, but also on some preferences of the present. For instance, if somebody is, has some food preferences, maybe sexual orientation, maybe other preferences in life, they build their identity on it. And, but past always has a role in play in there. Okay, so I think it is only natural to have past as a starting point of building your own identity. So it was my interest, me as a historian, it was my interest to see how this past is being built, not only about the facts. So it was sort of looking beyond facts.
Okay, and history textbooks, as you said, have always borne, you mentioned it, political and other influences. Historical facts remain facts, but their interpretation changes depending on a situation or on times and demands. Do you think that history can be taught without any political or other kind of influences?
First of all, we need to ask ourselves, what is education? Yeah? Education, especially public instruction or public education, it is a political act. It is by the decision of the government, and in most cases it is financed by the government. I mean public funds. So it is the government who decides that to channel public funds to education purposes. So in a way, the governing elite is the one who decides to instruct its own younger generation of the people, the history or the version of history it wants to. So in a way, it is inevitable. It should be political. Okay, even if we don't like it. The other question is what the policy is, what's the policy which follows the government. If it is a government who has as its aim to improve its legitimacy or just to maintain its, or to somehow try and look more legitimate in the eyes of the people, then it will create its own versions of history which are not that much which could sometimes be arbitrary. On the other hand, when it is a democratically elected one, and also it is in touch with the people whose demands are that to give a fair education, a fair representation of its past, then we can have something else. When public demand is to have a well-developed citizen who has critical thinking, then we can have something different than just whitewashed histories, let's call it this way.
In the Armenian case, can we say that Armenian people are ready for a more critical thinking?
Look, we're a young nation, after all. What concerns, even if we are an old ethnicity, that's true, but we're a young nation in the political sense, because nation is a political category rather than just ethnic union based on, I don't know, common language, common religion, and so on. We are still in the middle of shaping our national foundation myths. So it is a very hard moment, on one hand, to creating those myths, and on the other, of revising them. So it's a very contradictory task, let's face it. Though I would argue it is not an impossible one. So in a way we are not that ready. If we compare us with Western European nations, for instance, Germany, France, and so on. But on the other hand, we are actually we are in a moment at a critical juncture where we are about to review our own identity. So it can be, so the answer is both yes and no.
So precisely here, we just said that, you just said that it was, history can be contradicting. In your researches, you also say that there are gaps, sometimes very big gaps in the history textbooks and school books in Armenia. What kind of gaps do you mean? What are they exactly? And could you give us some examples of lacks?
Okay, first of all, history. Okay, one thing is history as such, and the other is history as historical writing. Historical writing, i.e. Interpretation of facts, historical so-called facts, could be very contradictory, depending on people who view them, and this selection of historical facts could be very arbitrary. So let's first of all agree that it's not history which is contradictory, but historical writing which is contradictory. Yeah, because there are people, identities, who are contradicting, or opinions who are contradicting each other. As to gaps in history, first, they could be quite different. We are quite accustomed to seeing our past being changed since the Soviet times, when, of course, some facts or some stories were silenced. But by stories, I mean interpretation of facts were quite silenced, or even some facts were silenced because they were not an easy thing to deal with. Later on, there were other facts which were not that easy to deal with. So there were different muted facts in Armenian history. And currently what we see, history is muted from religious quarters, nationalist quarters, could be partisan quarters. So different actors who are interested in muting and silencing some facts which are uneasy for them to interpret. I wouldn't go too much into detail because it will take, we are not that, I think we don't have that much time, but for instance, starting from medieval times, we see, or we hardly see, any representation of, for instance, non-apostolic Armenians, Armenians who could be referred, or communities who lived in Armenia, let's put it in this way.
So their role in the Armenian history is diminished or erased?
They are silenced altogether, or referred to only very just in a sketchy way, too sketchy way. For instance, if there were Catholic Armenian communities, what about I don't know, communities who were Tondraketsi, so-called, and Polisian, Pavlikian, as they put it in Armenian, communities, they were hardly referred to in Armenian history textbooks, school textbooks. In later history, of course, there's a lot more which was silenced. It was what concerns, and a major source for that is our Soviet legacy, where whatever bad came from the north was referred to as Tsarism, and whatever good was coming from there, it was plainly referred to as Russia. And currently, we're yet far from calling a spade, like calling things by their real name. We need to understand this. We need to realize, and of course, whether our relations with our great northern neighbor are good or bad. Okay, currently we're having sort of strategic relationship with them. Things need to be called by their real names. Of course, there is another exaggeration which sometimes we see by some Armenian authors, independent authors, not those who are creating history textbooks. And we need to come to sort of agreement on what that was. So it's a topic which is, it's an untapped topic yet, which needs its considerate and very meticulous research and also appreciation.
Related to that, Aras Anjan, who's a professor of history and the director of the Armenian Studies Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, in 2017, when he was analyzing the 2012 textbooks and school books, he in Armenia he said that the textbooks are written mostly by historians who got their degree and their education only in Armenia and have no broader perspective about a history. In this case, who benefits or loses from a history partially written?
Okay, as I said, history is written in line with some or another policy. If the policy is to promote democratic values and promote peaceful coexistence with your neighbors and so on, then history is written in one way. For instance, if you are in France and your political aim is to promote democracy and to promote inclusivity, because it's a great problem in that specific country, and you have no specific problems with your neighbors, historical claims and so on, then you write one sort of history. That's your government's order, let's put it this way. When you live in a country like in Armenia, where things are not yet clear that much, then you have another order. And of course, government will find whoever who is in charge of creating history textbooks will find their specialists. Believe me, even now in current Armenia, modern Armenia, it's not too hard a task to find people who could write adequate history. And it's not about lack of specialists who have Western degrees or who lack broader vision of Armenian history. Still, you can find them, or you can train them. It's not that hard a task.
So here is the will of governments to
And
orient.
also, yes, and also, as you mentioned in your previous question, it's about readiness of the public in general. Because if the government does something which is not in line with the hopes and beliefs and assumptions of the people, then the government, especially a democratically elected one, will face serious problems.
And so what are your recommendations for history textbooks? So should there be just facts, historical facts, and then those, based on those historical facts, push people to have their own assessment and judgment about history, or should there be also an interpretation of experts included in those textbooks?
There is a misleading conception or concept that representing mere facts is about so-called objectivity. This is not the case. Bad news. Because even the selection, a history textbook or any book is has its limits. And the selection itself also reflects some concepts of the person who selected it, because what was omitted, what was included, is also a reflection of sort of bias, of sort of own ideas. So that's one thing. The other thing is that compiling mere facts without any interpretation is, at least from the point of view of didactics, is too boring for a school kid. First of all, you need to introduce the concept, the background, because if no background, nobody, even a serious historian, cannot deal with, say, medieval documents. It's practically impossible to understand a document written 500 years ago, not going too far, without having a background. So that background should be necessarily provided. And it is not just history or positivist way of history. This thing is correct, this is incorrect. No, but the general environment. Let me bring you an example, and it is something that I recently found out. When writing about cultural life in 20th century, mid or Soviet times, maybe later Soviet times, it is written so much, for instance, Pariur Sevak, who wrote this and that, and Hovannes Shiraz, this and that, Silva Kapotykyan. What about city culture? What about the idea of rabbis, the concept of rabbis? How do we know? There is not a single word about it. But that was a part of city culture. And we have no idea what the rabbis subculture was in Soviet times, how it started, how it developed, and maybe how it came to our, and this is something which refers to our modern life, social life. So I think, first of all, history textbooks should provide a historical, or so-called, also socio-cultural, social cultural background. To provide tools for understanding the past. They could somehow, or it's not imaginable that history textbooks make no comments. But the higher the grade, okay, when students become more and more adult and more conscious, they should be asked to reflect on their own. there could be given some different ideas, and they could be asked about their opinion on various opinions. But without tools, it's a pointless thing. So textbooks for lower grades should be should be interpreted in a interpretation of historical facts in them should be how to put it, maybe more superficial, not going too much into detail, so that in higher grades it was possible to interpret them.
Okay. And last question, each country of this region in the Caucasus has their own history for sure, and with their perception of the history, do you think those countries can have one day a unified textbooks, as it is the case for Germany, France, and other European countries that decided to unify more, give more unified story of their own history after the World War II?
Okay, of course, it's better to be a dreamer than realist if you think so, but I think in a foreseeable future, we don't see such a case because, or we would need another regional war to settle, that's a joke. It is clear that to cut history as a pie, like a pie, along national lines is not very realistic. But on the other hand, there is an exaggeration of this, of writing a history of both countries simultaneously. Of course, there are historical events in France, for instance, which don't refer to the history of Germany and vice versa. But of course, there's a lot in common. So instead of that, it would be better to think of another project which is centered in national, on national grounds. For instance, in Armenia, I'll speak more about, of course, Armenia. We can have a contextualized history of Armenia in context with its neighbors, with the region. This is more feasible, this is more possible, and I saw some attempts at doing this in the previous years, maybe not that successful, but this line should be continued, and this is something to be thought about. Because when we, especially in case of Armenians, there are so many Armenian communities, there were so many Armenian communities living among others, and so much of Armenian culture and so on intertwined with the history of its neighbors, and it is virtually impossible to cut out the Armenian side of it and representing in the same time an adequate history of Armenians. So it's a must, and I think it should be done. But once again, it is not about making, I'd say, historical deals with your neighbors. Let's, to put it more simply, we do it for ourselves. We do it for having a more adequate picture of ourselves, of who we are. This can be a purely Armenian agenda, not an Armenian dash something agenda. Okay? When in the past, and especially when it is negotiated along political lines, there we can have also a certain distortions or certain bias, thinking that if we speak about this and that historical fact, which was unpleasant, and of course there were so much bad blood which was gone between us, each of our neighbors, each one of our neighbors in some historical period or another, when we think about reinterpreting them along friendship lines, there we can have another bias, which is anti-historical. Okay, let's put it this way.
Thank you, Tigran, for this conversation. Thank you for watching and continue to follow CivilNet.